Big Ten for me has 5 teams. I think 5 teams still have a realistic path. And here's where the caveat's going to come in. The first 4 are obvious, and then the 5th one is less obvious. And I'll talk through that. The top 4 are easy: Oregon, Penn State, Indiana, Ohio State, right? Like, we all know that. We can see Oregon's the number 1 team in the country. Penn State's undefeated. Indiana's undefeated. And then Ohio State is sitting there with just the 1 loss at what is now number 1 Oregon. So, they're just fine in terms of controlling their own destiny. I do think that Oregon probably, when it comes to any team around the country, has the cleanest path to the playoff of anybody based on what their schedule is to the end of the year and what they've already done. I don't see really a possibility of them even falling out of the Big Ten championship game, much less the playoff at this point. If you were to ask me, name one team that you are certain is going to go to the college football playoff, Oregon would be my top answer. They've got the cleanest path of anybody in the country. All right, so Penn State, that brings us to Penn State. They're undefeated at this point. And now you look at Penn State's schedule, and you see that monster game that we'll be at this Saturday. Cannot wait to get to Happy Valley. But you look at that and you're like, okay, 1 loss, they're in. They're in. An 11-1 Penn State, even if they weren't to get to the Big Ten championship game, they're going to go because we think highly of them. And I think that the committee is going to think highly of them next week when it comes to their rankings. I think it becomes more interesting if you look at Penn State as a possible 10-2 team. They're undefeated at this point. That would mean that they would have 2 losses in November, which would trend them in the wrong direction. And then you would look at their schedule. Let's just presume that one of those losses would be to Ohio State. And then you would look at that schedule and be like, well, what's the best win that they have? You see, I believe that there will be 10-2 teams on the outside looking in. That's my firm belief. Missouri could be one of those. And I think Penn State, it's questionable. Now, I would probably argue for them to be in at 10-2 because of the way that they've played so far. But I don't think it's a guarantee. So for me, does Penn State have leeway? Yes. Yeah, they could easily lose 1 game and still go to the college football playoff. But their best bet, keep it at 1 or none, right? Win this weekend against Ohio State, and they would absolutely be in the playoff. That's at least in my estimation. I think 10-2 would be dicey, but you win this week against Ohio State, and you are basically in Penn in the college football playoff. You would have a great chance to go to the Big Ten championship game, and you'd have a great chance to get a bye. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. Let's go to Indiana. Less obvious with Indiana because we're sitting here and they're still at 13th in the AP poll. Before I say anything more about Indiana, Indiana to me is the team that I'm actually most interested in to see how the playoff committee rates Indiana. Because here's what happens in the AP poll, and this is why the AP poll is such trash. It really is. And I'm sorry if you get offended by that, but it's true. The AP poll is like a NASCAR race. It matters where you qualified. So it matters where you started. And what the playoff committee is supposed to do is come in as if they did not see the rankings to begin the year, and they want to take a snapshot of what's going on after this week in our sport. And they need to say, who are the best teams who are the 25 best teams in college football? And they're not supposed to care where anybody started. See, because if you actually look at the way teams have performed, you will look at a team like, let's just sake of argument, Miami, and you would look at Indiana, and the playoff committee really should rank Indiana higher than Miami based on the way that they've played, their game control, their dominance, all of those different factors. But because Miami started up in the pack in the AP, they haven't been able to overtake them, speaking of Indiana, so they're still at 13. So the team that I'm most interested in for next week's playoff rankings, if they can take care of business against Michigan State on the road, would be the Indiana Hoosiers. Okay, so let's say for the sake of argument that the playoff committee, although I hope that this is not the case, but let's just say for the sake of argument, they have a similar feeling as the AP about Indiana. Okay, brand bias, whatever you want to call it, but they have a similar feeling. Well, then based on where they're sitting right now at number 13, to me, I think that they have to go minimum 11-1 in order to get in. You see, I don't think that they would be afforded a 10-2 berth into the college football playoff like some of these other teams that I think would absolutely make it at 10-2. So to me, Indiana can only lose one more. And once that happens, it becomes like, okay, you better win the rest of your games. So I think they need to go 11-1 to get in. They still haven't trailed in a game, by the way. They have been totally dominant, winning by 2 and 3 and 4 scores. They beat Nebraska by 49 the week before. Nebraska suffers only a 4-point loss in the shoe against Ohio State. You can build such a strong argument for Indiana. And this is why right now, hopefully those of you that are on the playoff committee, you're listening to this because this team is much better than 13th in the country. They just are. And if you put them at 13, it's going to put them behind the 8 ball. And I think that they're going to have to go 11-1. So we'll see exactly how that happens. I don't think they can go 10-2. And that's unfortunate for them. That brings us to Ohio State. Here's the deal with Ohio State. I think that if Ohio State were to take care of business outside of the Indiana and Penn State games, so beat the teams that you should. So that would be Purdue, Northwestern, and Michigan. Okay. I know that's going to make Michigan fans upset, but if you take care of business in those other games, I believe that then all they would need to do to go to the playoff is split the Penn State, Indiana 2 games. Because 10-2 Ohio State is one of those programs and brands and teams that we would absolutely say at 10-2 you're in. There's a lot of those, by the way. Georgia would be that way. Texas would be that way. I think Tennessee would be that way. I think A&M would be that way, which is why in a lot of those cases I've said those teams up there in the SEC, they could absolutely lose one more and get in. And the same can be said for Ohio State. I firmly believe that. So if they take care of business, then all they need to do is split Penn State and Indiana, and then they're going to go. Now, what they would rather do is beat all of those teams and get a rematch with Oregon so that they can get a bye in the first round of the college football playoffs. They want to go and win a Big Ten championship and get a bye in that first round. That's going to be their goal, and that's why this weekend is going to be so huge. And if they go out there and lose to Penn State, my goodness, then just think about the pressure that is on them against Purdue and Northwestern and Indiana, who's a great team, and then Michigan. I think that would be a fascinating end of the season for Ohio State. And then that kind of gets us to that 5th team. All right. And some might be thinking that I'm about to say Illinois, but I'm actually not. I don't think Illinois is a team that has enough. I think Illinois for me is very similar to Missouri. They could finish 10-2, absolutely, but they would lack enough marquee wins. Illinois, their best win would be like Nebraska, maybe Michigan, 2 double-digit losses, by the way, to their CFP contenders. That would be Penn State and Oregon. So I don't think it's Illinois. That's kind of a Missouri category. So who could go? Well, who is it, Joel? It's Michigan. It's Michigan. This is the only 9-3 team in the country that I believe actually has a realistic path to the playoff. Okay, and before you roll your eyes, just hear me out. Just hear me out. I've said all year I don't think 9-3 can get in. However, there's these 2 little caveats in there. And number one is that the CFP committee is supposed to take into consideration how you're playing at the time and what's happened previous in your season. And it's pretty stark that Michigan has had to try to develop an identity during the course of the year. We've all seen that. We've seen it play out. And they struggled early doing that, trying to replace their coach and all these players from a year ago. And they lost some games. Now, one of them is a really good team in Texas. They lost some other games, on the road, tough ones. And let's just say that they get it figured out. And sake of argument, and you might not think this is realistic, but if the defending national champions win out and they're 9-3, that would mean that they have wins in November, in November over the number 1 team in the country, Oregon, a top 10 team, at least in my estimation, Indiana, and another top 10 team, Ohio State. 2 of those wins could be against teams that are undefeated at the time. So I actually do think that there's a realistic path, but it's only because of that monster schedule down the stretch. Now, is there anything in the way that they've played that suggests that they're going to go out there and actually make a run? No, I'm just back of your mind, though. They've got enough talent on that defense. If they don't turn the ball over, like, could they beat Oregon? Maybe. We've seen crazier things this year. We've seen much crazier things this year than a team as talented as Michigan actually winning at home over an elite team. And that's what this weekend would be. So Michigan is playing for their lives this weekend against Oregon. If for some reason they win that game, they would jump up into the polls. The committee would love them because they would have, in a lot of cases, one of the best wins in the country, along with like Oregon over Ohio State or Georgia over Texas. And they would like them a lot, and they would knock them down a little bit, but they would still have Indiana and they would still have Ohio State. So there's this like realistic path for a 9-3 team, as long as you have those monsters down the stretch in order to build the resume. And as crazy as it sounds, I do think that they're the only 9-3 team that would have any argument. Now, would it be an argument? Absolutely, because they would have to pass some 10-2 teams as well. Thank you for watching the Joel Klatt Show YouTube channel. And if you liked this clip, make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel, and you can stay up to date on all of my college football coverage.